Welcome back to Vaulted World Secrets, and if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found us. Thank you for spending your time here tonight. Before we begin, the ancient Egyptians spent thousands of years constructing a meticulous, ordered afterlife, a place of judgment, balance, and divine law. So, why does the oldest religious text in human history describe their pharaoh not submitting to that system, but consuming it entirely? What does it tell us about what they truly believed waited for them in the dark? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Now let's begin. There is a text inscribed inside a pyramid that describes a pharaoh hunting gods, slaughtering them, eating them. Not as punishment, not as a metaphor constructed to soften the implications of the text. As a ritual declaration of what the king intended to become, the limestone corridor smells of nothing. It has smelled of nothing for 4,300 years. That is not silence. Silence implies something capable of breaking. This is something else entirely. The air inside the pyramid of Unas does not move. It has not moved in the way living air moves since the last priest sealed the final passage, backed out of the dark with careful, deliberate steps, and placed the last stone flush against the wall. The dust that settles inside this place has nowhere to go, and no reason to go anywhere. It accumulates in fractions of a millimeter across centuries that accumulate into millennia, layering in the same stillness, with the same patience with which the limestone around it was deposited at the bottom of a shallow sea 300 million years before any human hand ever touched it. The walls are covered in hieroglyphs. Every wall, every ceiling, every surface of the antechamber and the burial hall and the passages connecting them. These inscriptions are not decorations. They were never intended to be looked at for pleasure or for beauty, though beauty is present in their execution. The signs are precise, deeply cut, painted with mineral pigments that have held their color in certain sections for 4,000 years. They are instructions. They are a machine. And the machine was built for a single purpose, which was to ensure that the man placed in the sarcophagus at the center of this structure did not end when his body ended. The Pyramid of Unas stands at the edge of the Saqqara necropolis, roughly 30 kilometers south of what was then the administrative center of Memphis. In the year that would later be calculated as approximately 2355 BC, the Fifth Dynasty of the Old Kingdom was in its final stretch. Egypt had been a unified state for more than 700 years by that point, a length of time long enough that its institutions had developed the kind of dense, layered complexity that comes only from centuries of continuous operation and refinement, the complexity of a system that has encountered most of the problems it will ever encounter and has developed specific, tested responses to each of them. The bureaucracy that administered the Nile Valley from the Delta to the First Cataract was staffed by scribes trained in schools attached to the great temples, using a writing system developed over those same centuries into an instrument of extraordinary precision and expressive range. The theology that governed the relationship between the human and the divine had been developed and refined and systematized across the same period until it constituted one of the most sophisticated bodies of religious thought that the ancient world produced. And Unas was the last pharaoh to emerge from this particular moment in that development, a man who ruled for perhaps 30 years, whose military campaigns were modest, whose administrative record was unremarkable by the standards of the great empire builders who came before him, whose name would not be among the first ones spoken if you asked someone to name the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. His pyramid is the smallest of the royal pyramids at Saqqara. Its outer casing is largely gone, stripped by later builders who valued functional limestone over sacred geometry. From the outside, it looks like a ruin. A low, eroded mound of rougher internal masonry, pale against the pale sand, crumbling at its edges and partially buried at its base where the desert has accumulated against it without care across 43 centuries. Easy to walk past, easy to underestimate. That is the first contradiction of the site, and it is a significant one. The smallest pyramid, the most terrifying text, inside the burial chamber of Unas, on the walls and ceiling of the antechamber and the sarcophagus hall, are the oldest known corpus of religious writing in human history. Scholars would eventually name them the pyramid texts, a collection of spells, incantations, ritual formulas, and declarations that number in the hundreds, covering the journey of the pharaoh's soul from the moment of death through the trials of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, into the presence of the gods, and beyond. They were carved into the walls in a formal vertical hieroglyphic script, painted in a blue-green pigment made from crushed frit and mineral compounds that still holds its color in certain sections despite the passage of millennia. The ceilings were painted dark blue and set with 5-pointed stars in pale gold, the sky of the underworld, the sky the dead king would navigate. A fixed sky that did not move or change, because in the underworld, unlike in the world above, time did not operate in the same direction. Every surface that mattered was a surface that spoke. The chamber does not contain decoration. It contains a machine, and the machine is made of language, and the language was understood by the people who wrote it. Not as poetry and not as metaphor, but as engineering, as the construction of a functional system whose operating environment was death itself, and whose intended output was a king who survived it. These texts were not meant to be read by the living. They were meant to be activated. The Egyptians understood language as a technology in the most literal sense available to their civilization's conceptual framework. A word written in the correct context, in the correct orientation, surrounded by the correct ritual conditions, did not merely describe a thing. It created conditions in which that thing could occur. The distinction between description and activation was not the distinction the modern world draws between symbolic and literal in the Egyptian understanding. Writing was a form of doing. To write that the pharaoh would ascend was to participate in the mechanism of the ascension itself. To write that a gate would open was to hold the gate open. To write that a god would recognize the dead king and permit him passage was to compel the recognition and generate the permission. The priests who carved these words were not authors in any literary sense. They were engineers of a system whose tolerances they understood as precisely as the architects who calculated the weight-bearing capacity of the pyramid's limestone courses above their heads. They were building a machine. They knew what it was supposed to do. And they believed, with the complete certainty of people whose entire civilization rested on the premise, that it would do it. Among the hundreds of spells in the corpus, there is a sequence that has no parallel in any other religious text from ancient Egypt, not in the pyramid texts of the later Old Kingdom rulers, who adopted and expanded the practice, not in the coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom that democratized the tradition for non-royal elites, not in the elaborate collections of the New Kingdom that the modern world knows as the Book of the Dead. The sequence sits in utterances 273 and 274, positioned deep in the collection, not at the beginning, where one might expect the most critical operational declarations, but embedded in the middle, as though placed where it would be encountered only by something that had already progressed through the earlier stages of transformation. Its placement is not accidental. Nothing in the pyramid texts is accidental. The scribes who composed and arranged this collection spent their entire professional lives on the problem of death and the problem of what came after it. They did not make careless decisions about the sequence in which tools were provided, because a tool used out of sequence was not merely useless in the logic of this system, it was dangerous. The ordering of the utterances was part of the mechanism. The mechanism was everything. And this particular mechanism, placed this deliberately in this particular position, was understood to be the most extreme tool in the collection, the option of last resort, the weapon in the armory that the priests of the later dynasties would decide, after careful consideration, was too dangerous to pass on in its complete form. This sequence is called, by the scholars who have studied it since its discovery in the 19th century, the Cannibal Hymn. The name is theirs, not the Egyptians. The Egyptians did not name it. They did not need to name it separately from the larger corpus, because they knew what it was, and they knew what it was for, and they knew who it was written for, and the naming of it would have added nothing to the knowledge they already possessed. It was a description of what the king would do when he reached the gods, and the description is, by any clinical reading of the text, an act of predatory consumption so deliberate, so structured, so methodical in its organization and its progression that the word hymn feels like a category error. A hymn is praise. A hymn is the grateful expression of a relationship between the worshiper and the worshipped, in which the worshiper acknowledges the greater power of the entity they are addressing. This document operates in exactly the opposite direction. This is a threat. This is an operational document for the systematic acquisition of divine power through the physical destruction of the beings who hold it. And it is written in a language that its authors believed would make it happen. The text opens with the sky darkening, not dimming darkening, in the way that a flame darkens when it is extinguished, rather than when it is merely shaded. The stars go dark, the earth trembles, the pillars of heaven shake. In Egyptian cosmological understanding, these were not poetic images selected for their dramatic effect. They were descriptions of real events in the cosmological order, events that were understood to have physical consequences in both the world above and the world below. The principle of Ma'at, the cosmic balance and righteous order that underpinned all of creation, and that the pharaoh, during his lifetime, was the primary human instrument for maintaining experienced this disruption as a trembling at its foundations. The universe registered something. Something was approaching through the duat, through the passages and chambers and guarded thresholds of the underworld, and the universe registered its approach the way that a body of water registers the movement of something large through it, not through awareness, not through choice, but through the mechanics of being the kind of thing it is. A large enough disturbance produces waves. And the approach of the pharaoh through the afterlife, in the logic of this text, produces waves in the fabric of cosmic order that are visible across the entire structure of the universe simultaneously. The sky reacts, the earth reacts, the pillars of heaven react. Everything that holds the world in its shape reacts to the approach of this one dead king, and the reaction is not welcome. It is alarm. What is coming is the pharaoh. The text describes Unas rising in the form of a god who is hungry, not metaphorically hungry, not yearning, not desirous, not longing in some elevated spiritual sense. Hungry. The ancient Egyptian word used carries in its root a meaning related to a craving that precedes reason, that overrides all other functions, that was understood to exist at a level of the self below the level at which intention and choice operate. The pharaoh is described as the eldest of all the gods, older than Ra, older than Osiris, older than the gods who created the other gods. He is described as one who was born before hunger existed, as a quality in the world, and who now is hunger itself, given a body and given a blade and given a direction. He is described as carrying that blade. He is described as moving. The text says nothing about his intentions because his intentions are self-evident. The hunger is the intention. The approach is the intention. The blade is the intention made visible and made material and made capable of cutting. He is coming, and he is not coming to be judged, and he is not coming to be welcomed, and he is not coming to take his place in the ordered hierarchy of the divine. He is coming for something that the divine hierarchy possesses, and that he intends to take by the only method that guarantees complete transfer. The gods, in the text, see him coming. The gods are afraid. To understand why this is extraordinary, why it remains one of the most genuinely disturbing facts in the entire archaeological record of ancient Egypt, even after more than a century of scholarly interpretation that has produced every conceivable framework for domesticating its implications, it is necessary to understand what the gods were to the ancient Egyptians, not as a vague theological category, not as the colorful cast of a mythology designed to explain natural phenomena to people who had not yet developed scientific tools for understanding them, as a functional reality, as entities whose existence was not a matter of faith in the sense that the word now carries, but a matter of observation, observable in the movement of the sun, in the annual flooding of the Nile, in the coherence of the written word, in the continuation of the royal lineage, in every systematic regularity that the world displayed. The gods were the mechanisms of the world's regularity. They were not distant, they were not abstract. They were working, continuously, at enormous and poorly understood cost, and the human institutions that surrounded them, the temples, the priesthoods, the daily rituals, the offerings, the songs performed at specific hours were the maintenance apparatus that kept them working. A god that was not maintained weakened. A god that was not fed could withdraw its function. The function of Ra was the movement of the sun across the sky each day and its survival of the journey through the underworld each night. The function of Hapi was the flooding of the Nile and the deposit of the black silt that made the fields fertile. The function of Thoth was the coherence of language and the preservation of record. None of these were metaphors. They were understood as descriptions of actual causal relationships. The priests who maintained the gods were not performing symbolic acts of devotion. They were performing operational maintenance on the mechanisms of the physical world. The pharaoh occupied the central position in this arrangement, the point at which the human and the divine were understood to intersect most completely. He was not merely a king in the political sense, though he was that too, administering a large and complex state through an elaborate bureaucracy. He was the living incarnation of Horus, the falcon-headed god of kingship, the being in whom divine authority took its earthly form, and through whom the will of the gods was translated into the governance of the human world. Upon death, the pharaoh became identified with Osiris, the god of the dead and of resurrection, lord of the underworld through which all the dead were required to pass. And the new king, ascending to the throne upon his predecessor's death, took on the mantle of Horus and began the cycle again. This was not ceremony in the sense that ceremony is now understood, not performative, not symbolic in the sense of pointing to something beyond itself. It was understood as a literal transfer of divine identity, a process requiring ritual management to complete correctly, and that, if it failed, had consequences not just for the dead man, but for the stability of the entire system. The pyramid texts were the tools of that management. They were the equipment the dead king carried into the afterlife, the provisions for a journey through a terrain that was real and dangerous and required specific knowledge and specific words to navigate. In every other utterance in the entire corpus, the pharaoh moves through the afterlife as a supplicant who is progressively transformed into something divine. He is assisted by divine intermediaries. He is guided through thresholds by entities who recognize his identity and grant him passage. He is tested and found worthy. He is welcomed into the company of the gods through a process of recognition and acknowledgement that is structured, orderly, and oriented at every step toward the goal of his inclusion in a system that already exists and that will absorb him into itself. He is, in the most fundamental sense, seeking membership. He is the one who needs something from the gods' passage. Recognition, a place in the divine order, and the texts are the tools by which he demonstrates his worthiness for what he needs. In the Cannibal Hymn, the king does not seek membership. He does not need recognition. He does not demonstrate worthiness, because worthiness is a standard maintained by the system, and the system is what he has come to consume. He arrives as a predator, and membership is not offered because it is not on the table, and it is not on the table because the table itself is the meal. The text describes Unas hunting the gods as a hunter hunts large game in the marshland at the edge of the Nile Delta, moving through the thick papyrus reeds in the early morning light, the water cold and dark around his legs, the air still and thick with the smell of mud and living green things, moving with the patience and the silence of a being that has done this before and knows how it ends. It describes his aides entities identified in the text with the god Shesmu, who in other contexts was associated with the pressing of wine and oil, with the transformation of raw material into refined substance through the application of pressure and force, preparing the gods as a skilled butcher prepares large carcasses for consumption. The large gods are slaughtered for the midday meal. The small gods are slaughtered for the evening meal. The medium gods are reserved for later use. The old gods, the ancient ones, the ones who were present at the creation of the world and who have accumulated the longest history of divine function, are used as fuel for the fire beneath the cooking vessels. The text is specific about the order. It is specific about the method. It is specific about which qualities are consumed in which sequence and why. The power of wisdom is consumed before the power of strength. The power of longevity is consumed separately from the power of command. The power of creation is kept until last. This is not indiscriminate eating driven by hunger alone. This is a ritual of absorption, so methodical in its structure that it encodes a complete theory of how power moves between beings, how it is located in the one who possesses it, how it can be transferred, what conditions are required for the transfer to be complete, and what it means for the being who held it when the transfer is finished and the power is gone. It means they are gone, not diminished, not weakened, gone. The power and the being who held it were not separable in the way that a container and its contents are separable. They were the same thing. To take the power fully was to take the being entirely. There was nothing left when the consumption was complete. The pharaoh, in the logic of the Cannibal Hymn, does not become a god by being accepted into the company of gods. He becomes something that the category of God was not designed to contain, something that supersedes the divine order, rather than joining it by consuming the gods themselves. He does not enter the system and take his place within it. He takes the system apart, piece by piece, in a sequence as ordered and as purposeful as the construction of the chamber in which the words describing it are inscribed, and he incorporates the pieces into himself. And what he becomes at the end of this process is something the universe had not previously held. Something built from everything the gods were and everything the gods administered, combined with whatever the pharaoh was before he died, combined with the additional and irreducible quality that belongs only to the kind of being who could do this, who could look at the gods of the universe and perceive in them not a hierarchy to be joined, but a resource to be consumed. This is the quality the text is most interested in. This is what the text is, at its deepest level, about. It is about a specific kind of power that is not transferable by any means other than the one it describes, that can only be acquired by the being capable of the act of acquisition, and that exists in full only in the being who has completed it. There is a passage near the end of the main sequence that has received less attention in popular accounts of the hymn than it deserves. After the hunting and the slaughter, and the methodical consumption of the gods in their ordered categories, the text describes the state of the pharaoh when the process is complete. He is described as full, but not with the word for satisfaction or contentment or the specific pleasure of a body that has eaten well and rests in the warmth of its own metabolic comfort. The word carries a connotation of completion in the irreversible sense of a process that has run to its end and left the conditions of the world permanently altered. He has consumed what he has consumed, and the consuming cannot be undone, and the power is inside him, and the world around him has changed. The text is clinical about this. It does not celebrate the change. It does not mourn it. It describes it with the same flat precision that characterizes its description of the slaughter and the cooking and the consumption, the precision of a document whose purpose is to describe a process accurately so that the process can occur correctly. Something has been removed from the universe and placed inside the king. The universe is now arranged around an absence. And the absence is permanent, and it is the shape of everything the gods were and everything the gods administered, and the universe continues to function without it or does not function, or functions differently, or functions in a way that the text does not attempt to describe because the text was not composed for an audience that would survive to observe the result. The text was composed for the king. The king would be the result. He would not need to observe it from the outside. He would be it. The dominant scholarly interpretation of the Cannibal Hymn, the one that appears in academic publications and museum interpretive materials and educational summaries of Egyptian religion, is that the text is a metaphor, that the consumption of the gods is a symbolic representation of the pharaoh's absorption of divine qualities, a vivid and dramatic poetic expression of a theological concept that would seem crude if stated plainly, dressed in the language of physical action to give it the force and memorability that a purely abstract statement would lack. In this reading, the pharaoh does not literally hunt and eat the gods. He absorbs their power through a process that the culture of the time understood in terms of physical consumption, because the culture understood physical consumption as the most direct and complete form of incorporation available. The liver of a bull consumed after a ritual hunt was understood to confer the strength of the bull to the hunter who ate it. The heart of a defeated enemy, in some pre-dynastic traditions whose traces remain in later iconographic material, was understood to transfer the power and courage of the defeated into the victor. The Cannibal Hymn extends this logic into the divine realm, and the result is a text that describes the most complete possible form of divine absorption in the most vivid possible terms. This interpretation is reasonable. It is supported by genuine parallels in Egyptian ritual practice and in the broader cultural understanding of food and the body. Because in every other religious text from ancient Egypt, across the entire 3,000-year span of the tradition, the gods are not characterized by fear of the dead. The dead fear the gods. That is the directional logic of the entire system. The dead navigate a terrain created by gods, governed by gods, administered by gods. The dead require permission at every threshold. The dead depend on the goodwill of the divine order for every stage of their passage through it. In the Cannibal Hymn, the directional logic reverses completely. The dead king arrives, and the gods scatter. Their faces pale. They cover themselves. The guardian of the horizon cries out in alarm at the sight of what is approaching. And the alarm is not procedural. It is not the alarm of an official who has encountered an irregularity in the system and must refer it to a higher authority. It is the alarm of a being that has seen something it cannot manage and knows it cannot manage it and has no recourse available to it because the recourse would have needed to be built into the system, and the system is what is being consumed. The gods are afraid because they recognize what is coming, and what is coming is the thing that their system has no procedure for. Their system has procedures for everything the dead can be. It does not have a procedure for this. This inversion is what the text reveals most clearly about what the ancient Egyptians truly feared. The popular understanding of Egyptian afterlife belief, shaped primarily by the more developed and more systematized theological tradition of the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, by the imagery of the weighing of the heart, by the orderly moral accounting of the deceased's life, by the protective spells of the collection the modern world calls the Book of the Dead, presents an afterlife governed by moral logic, a place where the quality of a life is measurable, where actions accumulate into a ledger that can be assessed, where the heart of the deceased is weighed against the feather of Ma'at, and the result determines the outcome. This is an afterlife that makes sense in terms that human beings can plan for. The rules are known. The standard is clear. The outcome, for those who have lived correctly, is favorable. But the Cannibal Hymn belongs to a theological register that predates this orderly vision by several hundred years. And in the space between the two lies something important. A glimpse of what the Egyptians believed the afterlife actually was before they developed the philosophical frameworks designed to make it navigable, before they built the moral architecture that gave the well-lived life a guaranteed outcome, before the wilderness became a court. What the Cannibal Hymn describes is the wilderness itself, a place where power was the only currency, where the quality of a life, its justice, its adherence to Ma'at, its balanced heart, did not protect a dead man from a force that was more powerful than he was, and that did not care about the quality of his character. A place where survival was not a reward for virtue, but an outcome of power alone, and where the only adequate preparation for the darkness was to become the most powerful thing in it. The Cannibal Hymn is a response to this fear, the most extreme response that the Egyptian priestly tradition ever committed to stone. Not the response of making oneself acceptable to the powers of the afterlife, but the response of becoming more powerful than they are, permanently and irreversibly, by consuming them. The pharaoh does not navigate the wilderness of the Duat. He ends it. He takes it apart in the specific sequence described in the text and incorporates it into himself, and what he becomes when the process is complete is something that cannot be threatened by the wilderness, because the wilderness no longer exists separately from him. He is what the wilderness was made of. And this is what was inscribed on the walls of the smallest pyramid at Saqqara for a pharaoh whose historical legacy was otherwise unremarkable, placed there by priests who believed with complete certainty that the words they were carving would activate the process they described. The Pyramid of Unas was not the only royal pyramid to receive pyramid texts. After Unas, the practice spread to the pyramids of Teti, Pepi I, Merenre, Pepi II, and eventually to the pyramids of several queens associated with these later Old Kingdom rulers. The corpus grew as it spread, with new utterances composed and added, and the arrangement of existing ones varied according to the theological priorities of the priests who transmitted them. Scholars have been able to trace this transmission across the final dynasties of the Old Kingdom, through the first intermediate period of political fragmentation that followed its collapse and into the Middle Kingdom, where the tradition evolved and democratized into the coffin texts, a version of the same fundamental project made available to non-royal elites who wanted the same afterlife protections that had previously been the exclusive property of kings. What is notable in this transmission history, and what has been observed and documented in the scholarly literature without being fully explained, is what did not survive intact. The Cannibal Hymn, in its complete form, as it appears in the corpus of Unas, was not reproduced in the later pyramids in the same way as far as the surviving evidence currently allows scholars to determine. Elements of it appear in modified versions and abbreviated forms. The vocabulary of power it introduces, the claim that the pharaoh possesses a quality that the gods must acknowledge, the imagery of active dominance over the divine order, these elements were taken forward. But the full mechanism, the complete operational sequence, from the darkening sky to the organized slaughter, to the methodical consumption, to the description of the universe arranged around the permanent absence of what was consumed, that version, in that complete form, belongs to Unas alone. The later texts kept the conclusion without the procedure. They kept the destination without the map, and the absence of the map was not an oversight. It was a decision. One interpretation, held by a minority of scholars, but argued with rigor, and supported by a careful reading of the internal logic of Egyptian ritual practice, is that the Cannibal Hymn was understood by the priests who transmitted it to be too literally functional to reproduce in full at scale. If the texts worked as their composers intended, if writing the words created the conditions for the process they described, then a pharaoh equipped with the complete Cannibal Hymn was a pharaoh who, upon death, would move through the afterlife, consuming the divine order that the living priests were responsible for maintaining. A dead king who consumed the gods entirely would leave the priests on the surface of the earth administering temples whose objects no longer existed. The ceremonies that sustained the functions of the world would lose their purpose. The reciprocal arrangement between the human and the divine that held Egyptian civilization together would collapse from above, consumed from inside by the one person the entire system had been built around. In this interpretation, the Cannibal Hymn was used once, fully, with all its operating instructions intact, and then it was quietly modified in transmission, not because it was wrong, not because it did not work, but because the priests believed it would work and the civilization could not survive its working at scale. They kept the claim. They removed the procedure. They gave later kings the assertion of power over the gods without the specific mechanism by which that power was acquired, because the mechanism, reproduced in every royal burial across the generations that followed, would eventually leave nothing left to administer. The physical evidence of the burial itself reflects the care with which the entire project was conducted. The sarcophagus of Unas was carved from a single piece of dark greywacke, a dense, fine-grained stone quarried from the eastern desert at Wadi Hammamat, a site that required substantial organized labor to exploit the stone cut from the living rock of the desert plateau and transported overland and by river to Saqqara, across distances that demanded coordinated planning across multiple administrative departments. The interior of the sarcophagus was polished to a smoothness that the surrounding carved walls, for all their technical precision, do not match a smoothness of a specific kind, the smoothness of a surface prepared to receive something permanently, rather than the smoothness of a surface prepared to be admired. The mummy of Unas, of which only fragments have survived insufficient for meaningful physical analysis, was positioned with the head oriented west, toward the setting sun, in accordance with the established mortuary practice of the period. The grave goods that accompanied the burial, most of which were removed in antiquity by tomb robbers who cut access tunnels through the soft limestone of the surrounding mastaba fields, included amulets crafted from the stones and materials associated with afterlife protection, lapis lazuli, carnelian, green feldspar, gold canopic equipment for the preservation of the internal organs removed during mummification and placed in their own vessels under their own divine protection, and the tools required for the opening of the mouth ceremony, the ritual through which the dead pharaoh's senses and capacities were restored to him so that he could speak the spells inscribed on the walls around him, could hear the responses of whatever addressed him in the dark of the duat, could taste the offerings left for him in the mortuary temple, and could act on the instructions he had been given. The chamber was sealed. The pyramid was closed. The mortuary temple against its eastern face was staffed with priests whose function was to maintain the cult, to speak the name of Unas each day, to offer food and drink and incense, to perform the rituals that kept the dead king's identity active in the world of the living, and therefore in the Egyptian understanding of how the two worlds connected, active in the world of the dead as well. The boundary between the living and the dead was permeable. Maintenance performed on one side had effects on the other. The name spoken by the priest in the mortuary temple at dawn was heard by the dead king in whatever passage of the underworld he occupied. This was not metaphor. This was the operational premise of the entire system. The name Unas was spoken for some considerable time after his death. The archaeological record shows cult activity at the Unas complex, extending at least into the Middle Kingdom, roughly 500 years after his burial, which is itself an extraordinary span of institutional continuity, a demonstration of how seriously the obligation was taken. His name appears in later king lists, the administrative documents through which Egyptian scribes tracked the royal lineages of their civilization for both religious and historical purposes, though the lists are inconsistent in their treatment of Fifth Dynasty rulers, and some of them omit him. He is not a figure of major historical importance in the record that survives. He is a man who ruled at the end of a dynasty, administered the affairs of a large and complex state for approximately 3 decades, built a modest pyramid, and died, in the manner all pharaohs died, with the entire apparatus of one of the most sophisticated death management civilizations in human history arranged around him for the specific purpose of ensuring that his death was not the end of what he was. In 1952, the Egyptian archaeologist Abdel Salam Hussein, working in the Saqqara necropolis as part of an ongoing program of survey and documentation that had been underway for decades, conducted a detailed examination of the substructure of the Unas pyramid, the descending corridor, and the passages connecting it to the burial chamber, and produced several observations that have not received wide attention in subsequent popular accounts of the site. Among these was a careful notation regarding the condition of the wall surfaces in the descending corridor. The long sloping passage cut through the limestone bedrock from the original entrance on the north face of the pyramid down to the antechamber and the burial hall below. Hussein noted that in 2 specific sections of this corridor, the hieroglyphic inscriptions had been deliberately effaced, not eroded by the passage of time, not abraded by the movement of feet during the construction and sealing of the pyramid, but systematically removed by a careful cutting of the stone surface that took away the carved text and left the surrounding wall intact and undisturbed. The effacement was not hasty work. It required sustained effort and some skill. Someone had entered that corridor after the inscriptions were completed and before the corridor was finally sealed in the narrow window between the completion of the decoration and the closing of the pyramid, and had removed specific text from specific locations on the walls, doing so with a care that suggests the removal was considered important enough to be done correctly rather than merely quickly. The scholarly documentation of this observation exists in Hussein's excavation notes, held in the archives of the Egyptian Antiquities Organization, and in a brief cross-reference in a 1963 publication by the French Egyptologist Jean-Philippe Lauer who worked at Saqqara across several decades and who noted Hussein's findings in the context of his own broader examination of the Unas complex. Beyond these two references, if other scholarly treatments of this specific observation exist, they have not entered the wider literature in any prominent form. The erasure of text from sacred contexts was not unprecedented in ancient Egypt. The most widely known example is the systematic removal of Akhenaten's name and image from monuments across the country following the failure of his religious revolution and the restoration of the traditional cult under Horemheb. Other examples exist throughout the historical record. Officials who fell from power, political rivals whose existence required editing from the commemorative record, figures whose names were removed from processional inscriptions and offering lists as acts of deliberate historical and metaphysical management. But these erasures, without exception, occur in public contexts. They occur in temple reliefs visible to the populations who move through them, in commemorative stelae readable by anyone with access to the space, in processional inscriptions encountered by the participants in religious ceremonies. They are political acts with political audiences. The logic behind them is the logic of controlling the collective memory of a living community. The erasure inside the Unas pyramid belongs to an entirely different category. The descending corridor of the pyramid was not a public space. It was not a space at all. After the ceiling, it was the passage between the world and the tomb. And once the tomb was closed, it was sealed with the expectation that it would remain sealed for the duration of whatever followed. There was no audience for the text in that corridor. There was no living community whose collective memory required shaping by the removal of specific passages from a sealed underground passage that no living person was meant to access. The only conceivable audience for the inscriptions in that corridor was the dead king himself, moving through it on his way through the underworld, and the entities in the duat that the text addressed. The removal of specific passages from that context is not a political act. It is a ritual act, performed for a metaphysical audience. Someone entered that corridor carrying tools, in the dark, in the still and accumulating air of a space about to be permanently sealed, and removed specific words from walls that no living person was supposed to see again, not because a living person might be troubled by reading them, but because a dead king might use them. And the decision had been made by someone with the authority to make such a decision and the theological knowledge to understand its implications, that those specific words should not be available to him. What those words said cannot be recovered. The surface is gone. The pigment that might have helped identify the removed passages from traces in the surrounding stone is gone. There is no parallel text in any other pyramid that can be used to reconstruct the gap, because the gap is the gap, the specific absence of what was removed, unique to this corridor, unique to this pyramid, unique to the one pharaoh who was given the complete version of the most extreme text in the Egyptian priestly tradition, and then had specific portions of it cut away by someone who believed the cutting was necessary. It is an absence inside an absence, a hole in a text that already speaks of consuming the gods, located in a passage cut through the bedrock of the Saqqara plateau, inside a tomb, inside a pyramid, inside a necropolis that has been accumulating its dust and its absolute stillness for more than 4,000 years. The calcium carbonate film that covers portions of the burial chamber walls has been analyzed in recent decades using non-invasive spectroscopic techniques unavailable to the 19th and early 20th century excavators who first documented the chamber. These analyses have confirmed the mineral composition of the surviving pigment copper frit compounds producing the blue-green color, carbon black producing the darker elements, iron oxide compounds in various proportions producing the ochres and reds, and have provided data on the depth and uniformity of the carbonate layer that allows reasonably precise estimates of the rate of mineral deposition since the chamber was sealed. The data is consistent with the known age of the structure. The chamber has been accumulating its white film at a rate corresponding to roughly 1,400 years per millimeter of deposit in sections of the wall where no airflow has disturbed the accumulation process. In certain sections, the film has grown thick enough that the carved signs beneath are visible only as shadows, implications of form in the stone, rather than clearly legible signs, the text present but obscured, communicating through the resistance of the stone to the passage of time, rather than through the legibility of the individual hieroglyphs. This is the archaeology. The physical substrate of carved stone and mineral pigment and limestone geology and accumulated calcium carbonate that makes the words on the walls available to the instruments and trained eyes of the present century. The text is here. The stone is here. The evidence is available for examination within the constraints of what material analysis can provide, within the epistemological limits of a discipline that deals in objects and their measurable properties rather than in beliefs and their immeasurable consequences. What the evidence cannot provide is the interior experience of the ancient Egyptians who composed these words and believed they would function. What it cannot provide is certainty about what they feared, about what experience of death and the unknown that follows death produced in the minds of people who built their entire civilization around the management of that unknown. A text that described the ruler of their world as a predator arriving in the afterlife with a blade and a hunger older than hunger itself, who would hunt the gods and consume them in a sequence as methodical as a craftsman's inventory of tools, and leave the universe arranged around an absence it had never contained before. What the evidence cannot provide is an answer to the question of whether they were right, whether the afterlife is what the authors of this text believed it was, whether the wilderness they mapped in their rituals and their prayers corresponded to any actual terrain, whether the Cannibal Hymn is a document about a fiction that a sophisticated ancient culture constructed to manage its existential anxieties, or a document about something that human language, then and in every form it has taken since, is simply not adequate to represent in any other way. What the evidence provides is the text itself, written in the oldest known corpus of religious writing in human history, placed on the walls of the smallest pyramid at Saqqara, belonging to the most historically unremarkable pharaoh of the Fifth Dynasty, a man whose outer casing has been stripped for building material, whose mummy exists only in fragments too small for meaningful analysis, whose name appears inconsistently in the administrative records of the civilization he governed, who ruled for perhaps 30 years and left behind no military legacy, no architectural marvel visible from a distance, no administrative innovation preserved in the sources that survive. A man who built a modest pyramid and was buried in it with the most extreme set of afterlife operating instructions that the Egyptian priestly tradition ever produced, and who then had specific words cut from his corridor by someone who believed those words were too dangerous to leave available, and who was right about that in the only sense that the civilization following him was capable of demonstrating, the sense of a civilization that believed in it enough to act on it, to enter a sealed passage in a closed pyramid, to carry tools into the dark, and to cut text from walls that no living person was ever supposed to see again. The sky darkens, not dims darkens, in the way that a thing darkens when the source of its light is removed, rather than merely shaded. The stars go out one by one until the sky above the duat is the same color as the stone walls of the chamber in which the words describing this event are written. The earth trembles. The pillars of heaven shake not with the random violence of geological force, but with the specific shaking of a structure that has registered in its load-bearing elements the approach of something outside the parameters of its design, something that was not accounted for when the structure was built because the structure was built by the gods, and the gods did not build it to withstand themselves. They look up from whatever they are doing in the dark of the underworld they created and administer. They look toward the passage from which the disturbance is approaching. They recognize what is coming across the terrain of the duat, through the passages and gates and carefully staffed thresholds of the underworld that they themselves designed and built and have maintained across the entire history of the world. They recognize it because they have never seen it before, and what they have never seen before, coming toward them through the dark with a blade and a hunger that is older than hunger itself, and larger than the system they inhabit, is the one thing their system was never designed to process. They experience, for the first time in the entire span of Egyptian theological writing across 3,000 years of continuous composition, the one thing that was always supposed to flow in the other direction. The gods are afraid, and then the king arrives, and the text says what follows next. And what follows next has been sitting on the walls of that chamber, in the blue-green pigment that still holds in certain sections, against the white film of 4,300 years of mineral accumulation, waiting in the logic of a civilization that understood language as a technology, that understood a word written correctly in the correct context to be not a description of a process but a participation in it, a component of the mechanism itself, waiting to be activated by whatever comes through the dark and reads it and understands it and is hungry enough to use it. If you find yourself drawn to histories like this, the ones where the evidence is complete and the meaning is not, the ones where the archaeology stops precisely at the boundary of the question that matters most, consider subscribing. There are many more waiting, and most of them have not yet been fully understood.